Hello everyone. I'm John Gottfried. I'm a developer evangelist at Twilio. I have the pleasure of being Swift's roommate, and I'm a hacker historian today. So I'm going to tell you all a little bit about the history of the hackathon. I know that a lot of you came here from school and were not expecting to enter a history class. I apologize. I have a history degree. It's kind of my default persona. So we're just going to start off with that, and I think it's really important for all of you who are the people who are creating the future of hackathons to understand where this format came from and what the roots of this entire movement are. So that's what we're going to talk about starting off today, and hopefully that'll lead us into some interesting discussions about where to take hackathons next. So I'm going to go way back in time, probably to before like 99.9% of you were alive, maybe before your parents were married. We're going to go in 1975. So I'm going to read this quote off, and I'm curious if anyone has kind of heard this before or knows what it references. So, are you building your own computer? Terminal, TV typewriter, I/O device, or some other digital black magic box? Or are you buying time on a time-sharing service? That was a thing, look it up. If so, you might like to come to a gathering of people with like-minded interests, exchange information, swap ideas, talk shop, help work on a project, whatever. Raise your hand if you know what this is from. Okay, like 5 people. This is from the Homebrew Computer Club. Do you guys know what that is? Okay, so everyone knows what that is. Why do you know what that is? It's because that was where Apple was founded, among many other pretty influential tech companies. So let's talk about Homebrew for a minute, and then we're going to talk about this entire movement of computer clubs, because when I kind of looked into the history of hackathons, this is really where I found the roots to be. So Homebrew was a society of hobbyists in the early to mid-1970s that got together in their friend's garage to experiment with and build computers. You couldn't go buy an off-the-shelf computer at this time. You actually had to build it yourself. That was part of the challenge. And people really got together for the love of this new technology and invested their time and money in experimenting with it and building it. And it's very fascinating to me because there are a lot of stories that have come out of this, and it's kind of a mythological society here. But the reality was this was just a group of people like all of us that got together to just make and build and collaborate with one another purely because they were interested in this brand new technology. But Homebrew always kind of takes the spotlight, right? Because that's where Woz is from, that's where Steve Jobs is from. It's really kind of the focal point of a lot of the information out there about these societies. But the reality is that there were societies like this all over the country. In fact, in New Jersey, where a lot of you are from, the Trenton Computer Club actually ran until the late 90s as one of these hobbyist societies and was one of the largest ones in the country. So there's a lot of focus on the Homebrew Club, but the reality is these clubs are going on all over the country, just like hackathons are now. And in fact, they grew at a very, very fast pace. They popped up in the late 70s, and over the course of months, they grew to really go everywhere in the country. And we see a similar kind of evolution of how hackathons sprung up. This is a little dated now, but if you look at the kind of the 2 graphs, right? They're both kind of up and to the right there. And what we see is in both of these scenarios where people are getting a hold of new technology, finding peer groups to work with, it takes off an extremely fast pace. And there were actually magazines and publications, just like the blogs we have today, covering all these societies. And one really interesting one did a survey of all of the computer clubs in kind of the late 70s. And I think this quote here is really fascinating because it applies to a lot of what you are doing at the university level. It says, the survey shows rather clearly that there are many more hobbyists than there are university graduates in computer science. And this is in 1976. I hold the radical view that an hour spent debugging one's own machine or program is worth 10 hours of lecture on how to do it. I think that rings pretty true with the kind of idea behind student hackathons. And perhaps it gives us kind of an idea that all of these hackers and all of this kind of technology was being done for the same reasons it is today. But I think there's a reason that hackathons really only came about in the last couple of years, and these hobbyist groups, for the most part, faded out within 5 to 10 years. So even homebrew only lasted 4 or 5 years. So let's kind of talk about the evolution of these societies and how that kind of relates to the overall trends in the computer industry. So this is a graph of computer, smartphone, and tablet sales, if you could see it back there. You don't really need to read the data, but the important thing to read here is that from about 1975 to about 1995, there wasn't a ton of growth in the computer sales. Now, obviously, it's going from 0 to something, but if you compare it to how smartphones and tablets grew, in that same amount of time, they basically grew exponentially, where computers were growing pretty linearly. And there are some really important reasons for that that apply back to why hackathons have only taken off in the last couple of years. So we're looking at 1975, 1980 computer market share. There are about 5 different types of computers on there. And for those of you who aren't familiar with a lot of these, like the Altair and the Atari, each one is an individual, unique development platform, right? So imagine trying to learn how to develop on Windows compared to Mac, compared to Linux. Each of these is far more different than that. So there's a lot of competition and a lot of kind of differentiation that made it very difficult for people to adopt these technologies and slowed the growth of the industry in some ways. And this continued into the 80s. But during the 80s is when computers really started to gain the public eye, right? So 1982, and this is kind of interesting to some of you if you're from Drexel, they were the first university to require all students to have a computer. In 1982, if you could read that, it says, "You're about to become the proud owner of a 22-pound assistant." That's like kind of ridiculous, but this is kind of the first approach to really realizing that technology is going to be an integral part of not only school, but of life in general. And it started to enter the public eye during this period as well. How many of you recognize this? The only winning move is not to play? Again, like 5 people. This is an awesome movie called War Games. Came out in 1983. If you have not seen it, I highly recommend it. It's about some crazy hacker kids who defeat the communists with their hacking skills. It's really great. But again, like during the 80s, right, even though there's this really kind of competitive market, there's not a ton of new university graduates learning about it, it's starting to enter the public eye. And we go back to this graph here where there's tons of differentiation, tons of competition, and go 5 years ahead, it's nothing like that, right? So 1986, there's about 5 different competitors. 1987, it's basically only IBM. And if you go a couple more years in the future, it's only IBM and Mac. So these other systems, these other platforms are dropping like flies. And by the kind of 2000s, it's really only IBM and Mac. And Linux is certainly grouped into the IBM category. So if we go back to the graph again, right, it starts to make a lot more sense because only in the late 90s did we really start to standardize what people were developing on, right? So I think that goes a pretty long way towards explaining why these hacker movements and these hackathons didn't pop up during that period when there was so much new development going on. It's really because the barrier to entry was extremely high, right? So only when they started to standardize platforms, standardize development environments, did people start building this stuff. So that's kind of the background. That's kind of where we're going to start from. And now we can jump into where hackathons kind of started as they are today. Because obviously a lot of this stuff is, you know, ancient history, but it does kind of show us where these people came from. So 1999. 1999 was an awesome year. It was the year the Euro was established. It was the year Napster debuted. And I'm sad to say that it was also the year that Star Wars Episode 1 came out, which is a plague on the year, but it's okay. It was also the year that the hackathon name was coined. And what's really fascinating is that this word was used for the first time in a public way within 2 weeks of each other at 2 different events. So we're going to talk about each of these 2 different events and kind of how those have come to spawn all of the types of hackathons we see today. So the first one was the OpenBSD hackathon. This was a hackathon of 10 people. That's it. It was in June of 1999 in Alberta. And basically, someone posted to the OpenBSD mailing list, hey, does anyone want to get together and hack for a weekend? We have a lot of bugs to close. We have a lot of security holes to fix. And 10 people responded and got together at someone's house up in Canada and worked on it for a weekend. That was it. There was really nothing else to it than that. It was extremely communal. It was based around this single open source project, and it was kind of a very informal gathering. But what I find fascinating is not 2 weeks later, there was a hackathon at a developer conference run by Sun that was probably much more like what we've seen today. So Palm Pilots, I don't know how many of you have used them. They're kind of awesome. It's like an iPhone. Basically, in June 15th, 1999, 2 weeks after this OpenBSD hackathon happened, Sun decided to throw their own hackathon at their conference, and they were like, hey, we have all these developers coming to learn how to build on these awesome new Palm Pilots. We should run a competition for them to see who can build the best app. Now, take that as it is. I don't know if you compare them to any modern apps, but basically the idea was that you would use Java to build an app that communicates via infrared between two Palm Pilots. It's kind of terrible, but they ran this event. They called it a hackathon, and this was kind of the first competitive hackathon as we know it. Now, I think the important thing to realize from both of these two starter events is that neither one had any association with startups. One was from a pretty large enterprise company, and one was from an open source project. Neither one was focused around startups. They're both around building kind of communal projects, collaborating, and building interesting new applications. And we'll get back to that in a little bit as to kind of where the startup type hackathon came from. But from the beginning, right, from Homebrew, from the computer hobbyist societies, from OpenBSD, no one was really yet focused on startups, at least at hackathons. And in fact, as these hackathons kind of grew, right, and as they kind of spread to more events, you started to see kind of an anti-startup movement emerging in the hacker communities. So Super Happy Dev House is a really great example of this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept, but if you can read this comment, basically developers were getting tired of the business focus in Silicon Valley, which is kind of a really fascinating thing. At the top there it says, hey, so what's your business model? And the dude gets pissed off. And then the bottom is Dev House, and it says, so I've been learning Lisp. Nice, I'm writing my own dialect, right? So this was an attempt by the creators to take all of these meetups and all of these informal gatherings that were happening in the Bay Area and say, hey, okay, we want to get back to these roots and really focus on technology and on collaboration rather than business. Now, most of these people, incidentally, work at startups. They worked at tech companies. They were kind of in the industry, but they wanted their gatherings to be much more philosophical and high level and really focus on the technology itself. And so this event came around. It actually still runs today. They just get together in someone's house and hack for a weekend, party a little bit, and then demo what they built to each other as kind of a salon-style event. But even though that and the kind of OpenBSD and Sun were kind of the roots of this system, what most people think of when they think of a hackathon is social network. Zuck and all his Zuck buddies getting together and drinking and coding, and they challenge each other, and they do shots upside down, coding on a computer, like laptop stands. And the really interesting thing when you think about this Facebook hackathon is it was modeled on Super Happy Dev House. So think about that for a second. Super Happy Dev House is a rejection of startups. Facebook is a startup that said, hey, look at this. We got all these people together building awesome stuff. I bet we could use that for our own engineers. And so they said, okay, we'll use that idea internally. So they took this Super Happy Dev House concept and applied it into their internal engineering and hiring program. And arguably, Facebook has kind of a lot more knowledge in pop culture than Super Happy Dev House, but they both really came from the same place. Now, Facebook's a great example. It is what a lot of us think of when we think of hackathons, but really when we start to see like the modern hackathon, like you guys organize, like many other people organize, I kind of trace that back to Yahoo. So I know that Yahoo isn't exactly the coolest kid on the block anymore, but for a long time they were kind of one of the key development organizations in the world technologically. And when we think about kind of the origins of the hackathon, it actually came about with the name Hack Day in 2006 at Yahoo. And while we look at all these other events that I've talked about so far, none of them is really that similar to what you guys are doing. They're all kind of the roots of it, but they're not a direct analog. Yahoo really is. So this ad for their first hackathon says, we'll kick things off with a free-for-all developer day workshop. And if you go a little deeper into it, it's kind of interesting because Yahoo is trying to show how awesome they are as not a huge tech company, which you still see today. Details to come later, but we guarantee this won't be your usual corporate wedding band leading the crowd through 2 a.m. group sing-alongs of Brick House. We'll hack through the night, keep going through Saturday morning, and widen up all that evening with hacker demos. So the guys at Yahoo said, okay, we have all of these awesome hacker gatherings. We have all of these awesome developers at our company. We should open this up to the community and bring people in so that they can kind of collaborate and build things together over the course of a weekend in a non-corporate-y environment, right? Because people were kind of wanting to show that they were a cool startup company rather than this kind of like stiff corporate entity. And Yahoo kind of launched a lot of pretty interesting projects out of this, just like you see today, a lot of the corporate kind of internal hackathons like Dropbox has and Facebook has and many other companies have. So Yahoo invented the Hack Day. Much to my chagrin, they own hackday.org. That is not in use anymore, but they did invent this concept of the Hack Day, and this is probably the most modern format we can look back to. Granted, it was only about 8 years ago, but when we look back and say, like, hey, this is what is most similar to hackathons today, it's Yahoo Hack Day. So we'll talk about that in a short while. So Yahoo Hack Day. Now, all of the events thus far that I've talked about have not been about startups, right? Even the Facebook event, even the Yahoo event, were really about building interesting new technologies. None of these so far have been about startups. What really kind of came about to show that hackathons were related to startups in some way was Startup Weekend. Now, Startup Weekend, the founders of Startup Weekend saw this very successful event format. And they said, okay, these people are able to get hundreds of developers together to build things together over the course of a weekend. I wonder if we can do the same thing for non-technical people. And they were. But Startup Weekend, as it started, is actually fairly different from what it is today. The first Startup Weekend, they brought 70 people in to work on a single idea. I don't know what all of those 70 people were doing for 24 hours, but they were all working on a single idea. The first idea they worked on was VoSnap, which is a way to get a quick decision from a group. Again, I don't know what 70 people were doing on that, but they were all working on that single idea for a weekend. And it came directly out of Techstars as a nonprofit, which is kind of odd, right? Because it's a nonprofit encouraging startups, but they've managed to make it work. But it was, again, a very kind of communal, development and collaboration-focused event, right? You have all of these really smart people getting together and saying, hey, if developers can do it, we can too. Let's go build a business in 24 hours. And it's actually grown now to span the entire world. And I'm sure many of you have been to Startup Weekend events before. They're a lot of fun. But this is kind of where I see the origin of that association between hackathons and startups, right? All of the hacker events so far have really been about technology purely. Startup Weekend is kind of where they start focusing on developing startups, developing businesses within the same span of time. Now, over these kind of last 7 years, like since Startup Weekend founded, there have been a lot of different variations on hackathons. And what we're starting to see now is less kind of innovation in format and more innovation in topic or audience, right? So Music Hack Day is a perfect example of that. How many of you have been to a Music Hack Day? Oh my God. Okay, Music Hack Day is probably one of the best hackathons I've ever been to. I highly recommend it if you have a chance to go. It's a place for musicians and developers to get together and build technically interesting music hacks. Now, the reason that I think Music Hack Day is unique, and the reason why it kind of is so important to me, is because it's an open source hackathon. So anyone in the world can take this format that's been developed and kind of been proven and apply it in their own city. It's based directly on the Yahoo Hack Day format, except with a focus on music. And it gets everyone together to kind of just collaborate on something they really care about and are invested in. And there have been similar events about gaming, about videos, about all of these different topics now, about education, all kind of based on this initial open source format that Music Hack Day produced, right? So they got together, they wanted to do this, and they wanted to scale it without it being a centralized entity. Now, Music Hack Day was also kind of important to me because it was one of the first major hackathons in New York City. There have been hackathons here for a long time, but when General Assembly opened in 2011, Music Hack Day was the first event they threw, and it drew hundreds of people. Like, this was kind of unheard of at the time when most hackathons would draw about 50. So, very important event, still running today. I highly recommend you go. But it's kind of this first fork of this Yahoo Hack Day hackathon format into other topics, right? And we see a lot more forks of hackathons as we go forward. And so now I'm going to talk to what all of you care about, student hackathons. So, 2010, Hack NY. Now, I want to give PennApps its kind of shout out here because PennApps actually started in 2009, but they didn't throw their first hackathon until a little later. So it started out as an apps competition. But Hack NY is an awesome program in the city here that places students in startups in fellowships over the summer. But they also decided that they should run hackathons. So how many of you have been to a Hack NY hackathon? Oh man. Okay, again, I highly recommend you all go. I know I've been making a lot of recommendations, but I will explain why in a second. Hack NY brings together a couple hundred students for a weekend hackathon twice a year. And the sole focus of the weekend is to build something awesome, right? It's not about like showing off your crazy demo. It's not about building a startup. The only purpose is to build something crazy and awesome. One of the winners at the last Hack NY, which is my favorite because they didn't actually have any interface, was a breathalyzer that hooks up to your Git repo so that you can't commit drunk, right? Now, that's hilarious. It's clever. It doesn't even have an interface. It was just awesome. And so they started, they won one of the prizes. So Hack NY is really special, I think, in the student hackathon movement because it kind of kicked off this whole idea that student hackathons were a valuable thing to pursue, right? Not just as a recruiting thing for companies, not just as a crazy like way to get a bunch of kids together for a weekend. They really kind of showed that this was a way of getting the smartest students in technology to build things together for a weekend, right? And before that, it was kind of a group that most companies and most kind of hacker events were not focused on. And they didn't really necessarily see the value. And I think Hack NY actually did a lot to prove that this was not only a valuable way for all of the participants to learn and kind of find collaborators, but also a really valuable way for the tech world to kind of work with a lot of these really smart people. And Hack NY is kind of the start of this entire student hackathon movement, right? But it's a fairly small event, right? It's still only a couple hundred people. But when we start looking at like what the biggest events were and what kind of these newer hackathons might be based on, like I think TechCrunch Disrupt is a great example. TechCrunch Disrupt, I know a lot of you have been to it. I've definitely seen your faces before. Disrupt routinely drew about 600 people. Why? Because TechCrunch has a big name, they have a big reach, and they saw this model and wanted to replicate it for themselves. But actually, what a lot of people don't know is that TechCrunch Disrupt was founded by a couple hackers here in New York City. Sorry, not the conference, the Disrupt Hackathon. Founded by a couple hackers here in the city. And their goal was to take what that kind of Music Hack Day and Yahoo Hack Day and similar events had created and bring it to New York. And bring it to New York in a big way. Now, something kind of went wrong. They organized this great event, but then something happened. So how many of you recognize that app on screen there called Grouply, group.ly with 2 O's? It's kind of a terrible name. Groop.ly. Have any of you used that app? You have, okay. We have one person who's used that app. Only one person because it doesn't really exist in that form anymore, but Grouply is GroupMe. Grouply did not win Disrupt. In fact, they failed miserably. That's fascinating, I think, because they are often pointed to as kind of the shining example of how to build a startup at hackathons, and you'll actually hear more about that later, I believe. But they're kind of pointed to as a shining example of how to build a startup at a hackathon. But the reality is, A, they didn't win the hackathon, and B, they created it to solve their own problem, right? This was something that was created purely for the purpose of solving their problem and purely out of kind of the love of creating things at these events. And the first TechCrunch Hackathon was actually focused on a lot of similar things to what the Yahoo Hackathon was. It was focused on collaboration. It was focused on building things with your peers. It was focused on making something awesome. And it was actually only after the success of GroupMe that it kind of transformed into being focused more on startups and potential businesses. So, Disrupt. Now, Disrupt for a very long time was the biggest hackathon in the world, right? Routinely drawing 500 or 600 people. As many of you know, that's nothing compared to the student hackathons that have come out of that. So, PennApps. I know that a lot of the PennApps organizers are here, so I will try my best not to butcher your own history. But PennApps, the first PennApps hackathon, I believe, was in 2011. And what's that? So we can talk about that. So the first big PennApps hackathon was 2011, and they brought in hackers from not only Penn but all around the region. So HackNY pretty routinely was bringing people just from the metro area. There were some people from kind of outside of the area, but PennApps really started to bring people from all over the country. And it took this format that was kind of proven at Disrupt, proven at HackNY, and scaled it, right? So not only was it no longer serving a small, focused group of people, it was scaled so that it was really kind of approachable by a lot of new developers and a lot of developers who could not make it to these other events. And obviously, we've seen this grow pretty significantly just in the last year, right? Think about the hackathon you went to in 2012 or 2013 compared to the hackathon you just went to in the last month. I would argue that most of these events have 10x the number of people that they did a year or a year and a half ago. And this explosion has happened in large part because, I mean, not in large part, solely because of all of you, right? You are the people powering this expansion. And I think that's really important. You know, we saw MHacks, right, which I believe was the first hackathon to pass 1,000 people in attendance. And Alexi's disagreeing, but I know this is a constant battle between PennApps and MHacks. But MHacks was a huge hackathon. PennApps was a huge hackathon. The numbers really are insignificant because the scale is what's important, right? It's the fact that no longer are these events necessarily just for small, focused, local groups. They're actually a way to meet people and collaborate with people completely outside of your normal circles and completely outside of your normal kind of reach, right? The people you can meet at these events are from all over the world, and they've come from hundreds of different schools. And I think that this is really fascinating to me. Someone recently asked me, what hackathon should I go to not for students? And I did not have a single recommendation. Now, I don't know about any of you, but if you've tried to search recently for non-student hackathons, they're kind of becoming a dying breed. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think it all kind of traces back to that original core kind of values of the Homebrew Computer Club, right? These are people getting together to build technology, to experiment with new technology, to meet their peers. And to me, at least, as someone who's kind of been an organizer of a lot of events and a sponsor of a lot of events, a lot of these bigger hackathons and a lot of these bigger hackathon series that have been coming about lately, not geared towards students, have kind of lost that focus. they've pretty frequently become focused on prizes and startups and businesses, and lost kind of the focus on developers and serving the people that are actually attending their events. And so when we think about what's next, right, what is after kind of the mega hackathon that everyone is organizing now, I think it's really important for us to kind of look back at this very long, almost 40-year history now, and think about where these events came from, and think about kind of the core reasons that people are attending them in the first place, right? I think that the same still applies from 1976 when they did that survey, that going to a hackathon is one of the best ways in the world to improve your skills and meet interesting, smart people that exists, right? It's in many ways better than class. And I think that when we think about where to kind of take hackathons next and what is kind of the next evolution of this format, that's really important to kind of think about the core value that people provide, right? I don't know about you, but as a developer, the prize is secondary, right? The sponsors are secondary, and I hate saying that because I'm a sponsor, but the sponsors are secondary, the prize is secondary, the startups are secondary, right? What really matters, at least to me, and I think many of you will agree, is building something that you care about, building something awesome, and getting the respect of your peers, right? This is about the collaborative hacker environment. And I think this kind of all goes back to this kind of summary that I'll provide for kind of the whole evolution of these events, that hacking is really an art, right? Hacking is a craft. I don't know of many, if any, other industries where people get paid extremely high salaries, they get really awesome creative jobs, and yet they still go do their job for fun, right? Like, I don't know any plumbers who go fix pipes for fun. But I know a hell of a lot of developers that go code for fun. And I think that that is kind of what we as hackathon organizers always need to remember, is that the reason people started working on this, the reason people continue working on this, is in many ways for the love of the craft. And however we can create events to serve that purpose and to serve that audience and really give people what they care about, I think that will be very important going forward, and very important in kind of developing the next wave of hackathons and hopefully some new formats coming out of that. So thank you, everyone. I'm John Gottfried, and I'm Developer Evangelist.